The memory came to her not in images but in scents and textures. The sterile, lemon-tinged smell of antiseptic clinging to the floral bedsheets, the papery coolness of her mother's hand resting in hers, and the unnerving quiet of a room where breath was measured in shallow, deliberate counts. Ilara Vance existed in these sensory echoes, a life defined by the quiet, thankless duty of tending to a slow fade. She was 22, yet her youth felt like a borrowed coat she'd never had the chance to truly wear. The world outside the sick room had moved on, painting itself in vibrant colors of first loves and bold mistakes, while hers remained a watercolor sketch of hushed corridors and whispered reassurances. A profound and hollow ache had settled deep within her bones, the kind of emptiness left behind when one's entire purpose simply ceases to be. If you want to discover how this past of sacrifice will shape a future she never imagined, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her reflection in the grimy bus window was a ghost superimposed over the blur of passing countryside. A pale, serious face framed by soft brown hair, with eyes that held the weary wisdom of someone much older. Ilara Vance, aspiring art conservationist, was now simply Ilara Vance, nanny. The title felt foreign on her tongue, a role she'd accepted out of a desperate need to fill the void with a new form of caregiving. In her lap, a worn, leather-bound sketchbook held the remnants of her deferred dreams, detailed charcoal studies of cracked paint on Renaissance canvases and the delicate anatomy of marble statues. Her fingers, perpetually smudged with graphite, were the only part of her that still remembered the person she was meant to become before life and death had intervened and set her on this entirely different, far more practical path. Her virginity was not a statement or a sacred vow, but a quiet consequence of a life lived on the periphery. While girls her age were learning the clumsy art of a first kiss behind the bleachers, or the thrilling fear of a whispered confession in a darkened car, Ilara was mastering the precise measurements of liquid morphine and the gentle cadence of reading aloud to a mind clouded by pain. Her heart had been occupied wholly and completely by a different kind of love, a filial devotion so consuming it left no room for anything else. The very concept of romantic intimacy was an abstraction, a language spoken in a foreign country she'd never visited. It was associated not with joy or discovery, but with a terrifying vulnerability, a potential for a loss so profound she instinctively built walls to keep it at bay. Now, with her mother gone, the silence she had once craved was an oppressive entity. The purpose that had anchored her for years had vanished, leaving a disorienting emptiness in its wake. This new job, this journey into the cold heart of the city to care for a stranger's child, was a desperate attempt to outrun that silence. It was a continuation of a familiar pattern, dedicating herself to the needs of another to avoid confronting the vast, terrifying landscape of her own. She had become an expert observer of life, standing on the outside looking in, her own desires and needs pressed flat against the glass like a forgotten photograph. She was moving toward a new cage, hoping its gilded bars would feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary from the disquiet of her own unlived life. The transition from her small, predictable town to the sprawling metropolis was a violent assault on her senses. The familiar scent of damp earth and cut grass was replaced by the acrid smell of exhaust and hot pavement. Buildings of glass and steel clawed at the sky, casting long, oppressive shadows that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. Ilara felt herself shrink, a small, insignificant figure in a river of anonymous faces, each one moving with a purpose and velocity that was utterly alien to her. The address she clutched in her hand led her to a neighborhood of imposing, silent mansions, each one hidden behind formidable iron gates. Julian Croft's residence was the most severe of all, a fortress of sharp modernist lines, gray stone, and dark reflective windows that gave nothing away, a monument to wealth and isolation. Stepping through the massive front door was like entering a mausoleum. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint, clean scent of polished marble and nothing else. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the gleaming floors, and her own breath seemed an intrusion in the cavernous, echoing silence. The house was a masterpiece of minimalist design, with vast, sparsely furnished rooms, walls of glass that overlooked a sterile, perfectly manicured garden, and a stark, monochromatic color palette that offered no warmth or comfort. It was a space designed not for living, but for display, a museum curated by a ghost. Ilara felt an immediate, visceral chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the palpable presence of absence, a grief so profound it had seeped into the very foundation of the home. She stood alone in the grand entryway, her worn canvas bag a stark, humble contrast to the opulent emptiness surrounding her. She had traded the intimate, cluttered silence of a sick room for the cold, expansive silence of a broken home. A profound sense of trepidation settled over her. This was not merely a job. It was an entry into a world of immense wealth and, she suspected, immense pain. The invisible weight of the house pressed down on her, a silent testament to the sorrow of the child she was here to care for, and the man who was its master. She clutched the strap of her bag, her knuckles white, sensing that her own quiet, carefully guarded heart was about to face a test far greater than any she had ever known. The real journey was only just beginning. Her father's house was the antithesis of the Croft mansion. Where Julian Croft's home was a study in expansive, echoing voids, her childhood home was dense with the accumulated strata of a life and a death. The air was thick with the scent of her father's pipe tobacco, old books, and the lingering, phantom smell of her mother's lavender sachets, now faded and dusty. Every surface was cluttered with memories, framed photographs of a family that was no longer whole, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and her mother's collection of porcelain birds gathering dust on the mantelpiece. Ilara moved through these rooms not as a daughter, but as a curator of a sad, stagnant museum. The worn armchair where her father sat was a throne of grief, its fabric imbued with the weight of his silent, unending sorrow, a constant, unspoken demand on her own vitality. Her father, Arthur, was a man hollowed out by loss. His love for Ilara was undeniable, a quiet, steady thing, but it was now tangled with a desperate, clinging need that felt like a thick vine around her ankles. Their conversations were circular, orbiting the mundane logistics of survival. "Did the check clear, Ellie?" he would ask, his eyes not quite meeting hers, fixed instead on the middle distance where his wife's ghost seemed to perpetually reside. He never asked about her dreams, about the art that once lit a fire in her eyes. His concern was for her utility, for the stability her paycheck provided. He was a good man trapped in his own pain, and in his helplessness, he had inadvertently become her jailer, his quiet dependence a far more effective cage than any iron lock or key. Her routine here was a seamless continuation of the one she had perfected during her mother's illness, a liturgy of caregiving that left no space for her own existence. Mornings began before sunrise, measuring out his heart medication into a plastic pill organizer, brewing coffee the way he liked it, strong and black, and leaving a simple breakfast on the table. She managed the household accounts, her elegant artist's hands instead tallying columns of bleak figures, the mounting medical debts a constant, humming anxiety in the back of her mind. She was the buffer between her father and the harsh realities of their financial decline, absorbing the stress so he could remain undisturbed in his mourning. She was not living, she was functioning, a ghost of a daughter tending to the ghost of a father in a house haunted by a wife and mother. The town itself was a larger version of her father's house, small, insular, and suffocatingly familiar. A walk to the post office was a gauntlet of well-meaning but invasive inquiries from people who had known her since she was a girl in pigtails. Mrs. Gable from next door would catch her by the garden fence, her eyes filled with a pity that felt like acid. "It's good you're looking after your father, dear," she'd say, her tone implying it was a life sentence. "But you need a life of your own. A nice young man to help with the burden." They saw her not as Ilara, the aspiring conservator, but as Arthur Vance's dutiful daughter, a permanent fixture in a local tragedy, her future already written for her. A quiet marriage to a local boy, a life spent within the same few square miles, a slow, predictable fading. A weekly phone call from her Aunt Carol was another turn of the screw. Her aunt's voice, sharp and practical, always carried a faint undercurrent of disapproval. "This nanny job in the city, it's not permanent, is it, Ilara? You're a pretty girl. You should be settling down, not cleaning up after some rich man's problems. Your father needs you here. close by. Each word was a small, carefully placed stone, building a wall of guilt around Ilara's heart. The unspoken accusation was always there, that by seeking even this small measure of independence, she was abandoning her post, shirking the sacred filial duty that her mother's death had passed down to her. Her aunt spoke of obligation as if it were a genetic trait, an inheritance from which there was no escape, a moral debt that could never be fully repaid. One afternoon, while searching for a spare blanket in the hall closet, her fingers brushed against a garment bag. Inside, sealed in plastic, was her mother's wedding dress, a simple, elegant gown of ivory silk and delicate lace, preserved for a day her mother had dreamed of. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through her. It was not a symbol of love or hope, but of a preordained path, a future she was expected to step into as seamlessly as she would the dress. She could almost feel the weight of the fabric, the constriction of the bodice, the expectations of a town, of a family, of a ghost. It was a beautiful thing, but it felt like a shroud. She quickly zipped the bag shut, pushing it back into the darkness, as if trying to bury a future she desperately did not want. There were moments, usually late at night when the house was finally still, that she would try to reclaim a piece of herself. She would open her sketchbook, the charcoal feeling like a foreign object in her hand. She attempted to draw the play of shadow on the worn floral wallpaper, or the tired lines etched around her father's sleeping mouth, but the inspiration wouldn't come. The air was too heavy, her mind too cluttered with grocery lists and unpaid bills. Her passion for art felt like a distant memory from another life, a foolish, selfish indulgence. How could she justify spending hours capturing beauty on a page when the grim reality of their existence demanded such relentless, ugly pragmatism? The artist within her was starving, locked away in a dark room of her soul while the caregiver ran the house. The financial pressure was the most tangible bar of her cage. Spreading the bills across the worn oak of the kitchen table, Ilara felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The sheer volume of debt left behind by her mother's long, futile fight was staggering. Each envelope was a reminder of their vulnerability, of how close they were to losing everything. The salary from the croft position, which seemed so substantial from a distance, was merely a finger in a cracking dam. This job was not a stepping stone to her future. It was a desperate, ongoing act of triage. Every decision she made was dictated by these numbers, every path forward narrowed by the unforgiving logic of what they could and could not afford. Freedom was a luxury, and she was mortgaged to the hilt. One evening, as she was preparing to leave for her week at the mansion, her father looked up from his newspaper, his eyes unusually clear. "You're a good daughter, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with a rare, raw emotion. "You're just like your mother, always taking care of everyone else. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're all I have left." The words were meant as the highest form of praise, a testament of his love, but they landed like a death sentence. They chained her to her mother's legacy of self-sacrifice, erasing any distinction between who she was and what she did for him. The love was a crushing weight, a silent promise he was asking her to keep, to never leave, to never have a life that did not revolve entirely around his needs. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet tree-lined street she had known her entire life, Ilara felt an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. This small, familiar world was her prison, constructed of love, duty, and the crushing weight of memory. The Croft mansion, with its cold marble floors and its own profound sadness, suddenly seemed less like a new cage and more like a strange, paradoxical form of escape. It was a world of different sorrows, of different silences. While she was trading one form of servitude for another, at least there, in that vast and empty house, there was a sliver of anonymity. There, she was just the nanny, a role she could perhaps, one day, take off. Here, she was a daughter, and that was a role she felt she would never be allowed to outgrow. He did not arrive. He materialized. One moment, the cavernous hall was a tomb of silent marble and shadow, and the next, a shift in the atmosphere announced his presence. It wasn't a sound at first, but a change in pressure. The subtle displacement of air as a heavy outer door closed somewhere deep within the house. Then came the sound of footsteps, not hurried, but deliberate and heavy, the rhythm of a man who owned not just the floor beneath his feet, but the very ground on which the house was built. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She stood straighter, smoothing the front of her simple dress, her hands suddenly clammy. All the stories she had heard about Julian Croft, the ruthless businessman, the grieving recluse, coalesced into this one approaching sound, and she felt a tremor of fear that was entirely separate from the simple nervousness of starting a new job. He appeared at the far end of the hall, a figure sculpted from shadow and sharp angles. Julian Croft was taller than she had imagined, his frame encased in a suit of such dark, immaculate tailoring that it seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of immense, contained power. Yet, for all his physical dominance, it was his face that captured her. It was a study in harsh, beautiful lines, a strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile. But his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a profound and chilling exhaustion. He carried his immense wealth and power not like a crown, but like an impossibly heavy coat, and as he walked toward her, Ilara felt not like an employee about to be greeted, but like an obstacle about to be assessed. His gaze finally fell upon her, and the air grew colder still. It was not a glance of curiosity or welcome, but one of swift, dismissive appraisal. His eyes swept over her, from her worn but clean shoes to the simple silver locket at her throat, lingering for a fraction of a second on the frayed edge of her canvas bag. Ilara felt herself shrink under the intensity of that look, feeling suddenly unsophisticated, provincial, and entirely out of place. It was as if he could see every insecurity she possessed, every crack in her carefully constructed composure. He saw the small-town girl playing dress-up in a world she couldn't possibly comprehend. There was no flicker of kindness in his expression, only a remote, calculating intelligence that made her feel more like a line item on a ledger than a human being. "You are Miss Vance." His voice was the final chilling piece of the portrait. It was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as polished stone and just as cold, stripped of any discernible emotion. It was not a question but a statement of fact, delivered with an air of weary finality, as if her arrival were merely another tedious detail in a day filled with them. "Yes, Mr. Croft," she managed to reply, her own voice sounding thin and fragile in the vast, echoing space. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold it for a moment longer than was comfortable, a small, silent rebellion against his immediate and overwhelming dismissal of her. She would not be cowed. She had faced death. She could surely face this cold, broken man. He began to move, not toward her but around her, a slow, deliberate circle that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. He didn't speak again for a long moment. The only sound, the soft whisper of his expensive suit, and the hard tap of his leather shoes on the marble. "My assistant informed me you have experience with difficult situations," he said, his back now partially to her as he examined a stark, abstract painting on the wall. The question was veiled, a subtle probe into the nature of her past. He was not asking about her childcare credentials. He was asking about her capacity for enduring sorrow. He was testing her fortitude, searching for the resilience he required to handle the oppressive atmosphere of his home and the silent grief of his child. Ilara's mind flew back to the sick room, to the long, quiet hours of her mother's decline. "I was my mother's primary caregiver for several years," she answered, her voice gaining a quiet strength from the truth of the memory. "She had a long illness." She offered no further details, no embellishment designed to evoke pity. The simple, unadorned fact of her experience hung in the air between them, a testament to a strength forged in loss, not in a classroom. She saw his shoulders tense slightly at her words. He stopped his pacing and turned slowly to face her again. Her quiet dignity, her refusal to perform her grief for his approval, had clearly struck an unexpected chord. It was a language of pain he understood far too well. For the briefest of moments, the mask of cold indifference slipped. His gaze lost its sharp analytical edge, and something raw, something akin to recognition, flickered in their depths. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the prospective nanny, but a fellow survivor. His eyes dropped to her hands, clasped in front of her, and he noticed the faint, dark smudges of charcoal dust ingrained in her cuticles, a small, incongruous detail that spoke of a hidden, softer world. The sight of it, a sign of art and creation in his sterile mausoleum of a house, intrigued him more than any resume ever could. In that fleeting second, Alara saw past the billionaire and the tyrant, and glimpsed the wounded man beneath, a prisoner in his own life, and her heart gave an involuntary, compassionate lurch. The moment passed as quickly as it came. The mask slid back into place, colder and more impenetrable than before. "My daughter, Amelia," he stated, his tone once again clipped and impersonal, "has not spoken a word since her mother's death 2 years ago." The last nanny lasted 3 weeks. The information was delivered like a surgeon's diagnosis, clinical and brutal. He was not just outlining the job, he was issuing a warning, daring her to fail, perhaps even hoping she would, so he could retreat back into his perfectly ordered, isolated misery. Alara felt a pang of sorrow not for the cold man in front of her, but for the silent 5-year-old girl trapped somewhere in this vast, empty house with a father who spoke of her as if she were a broken object. He gestured vaguely toward the grand, sweeping staircase. "Your quarters are in the east wing. Amelia's are adjacent. You will have access to the kitchen, the library, and the gardens. The west wing is private. You are not to enter it under any circumstances. Your duties are confined to the child. You will ensure she is fed, clothed, and kept from trouble. Otherwise, your presence should be unnoticed." The rules were clear, the boundaries drawn as sharply as the architectural lines of the house itself. He was hiring a caregiver for his daughter, but he was building a wall around himself. She was to be a ghost in his home, a functional presence with no emotional footprint, tasked with managing his pain by proxy. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his broad back a rigid wall of dismissal. The sound of his footsteps receded down the long corridor, the echo swallowed by the immense silence he left in his wake. Alara stood alone in the center of the grand hall, the chill of his presence lingering on her skin. She was intimidated, yes, but she was also filled with a new and unexpected sense of purpose. He had shown her the wound, the broken heart of this house, a silent little girl and a father who had forgotten how to live. She looked up the magnificent staircase, towards the rooms where the child waited, and felt not fear but a deep, resonant pull. This was not just a job. It was a rescue mission. The days bled into a quiet routine, a fragile truce with the mansion's oppressive silence, brokered by the small, steady presence of Amelia. Julian Croft became a connoisseur of moments he was not part of. From the shadowed archway of the library or the top of the grand staircase, he would watch Alara with his daughter. He observed the way she didn't force interaction but created an inviting space for it, often sitting on the floor with her sketchbook, her charcoal stick whispering across the page, until Amelia's curiosity would finally draw her near. He saw the first time Amelia tentatively touched Alara's hand, a small, revolutionary gesture in a house where touch had become a forgotten language. A complex and painful emotion twisted in his gut, gratitude warring with a profound, searing envy for the simple, gentle connection she was forging where he had so utterly failed. For Alara, these moments were her sanctuary. Amelia's silent world was one she understood. It was a landscape of unspoken needs and quiet observation, familiar territory for a girl who had spent years interpreting the flicker of an eyelid or the slight shift in a loved one's breathing. She began to teach Amelia to communicate not with words but with colors, laying out jars of vibrant paint on the cold marble floor. A fiery red for anger, a soft blue for sadness, a brilliant yellow for a fleeting moment of joy when a sunbeam hit the wall just right. She was not just caring for the child. She was giving her a new vocabulary, one that bypassed the trauma that had stolen her voice. And in doing so, Alara felt a flicker of her old self, the artist, reawakening in the service of healing another. Julian's observations grew more frequent, less concealed. He would appear in the doorway of the playroom, leaning against the frame, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the soft colors and gentle quiet within. He never spoke, never intruded, but his presence was a tangible thing, a weight in the air that both unsettled and intrigued Alara. She could feel his stormy gaze on her, studying her every move. It was not the cold, dismissive appraisal of their first meeting, but something more complex, more searching. He was looking at her as if she were an unsolvable equation, a variable he had not anticipated in the sterile, controlled environment of his grief. She felt a strange, fluttering warmth under his scrutiny, a nascent awareness of herself as a woman, something her life of service had long suppressed. The first physical contact was an accident, a collision of two worlds in a dimly lit corridor. Ilara was carrying a stack of Amelia's art books, her head down as she rounded a corner, and she walked directly into him. The books scattered across the floor in a silent explosion of paper and cardboard. But before she could even register the mess, his hands were on her arms, steadying her. His touch was not gentle. It was firm, possessive, a reflex of pure strength. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her, stealing the air from her lungs. It was nothing like the chaste, papery touch of her mother's hand, or the clumsy bumps of strangers in a crowd. This was different. It was charged, intentional, and it awakened a part of her she never knew existed. For a long, breathless moment they remained frozen, his hands gripping her arms, the scent of expensive cologne and clean linen overwhelming her senses. His face was inches from hers, and in the dim light she saw the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. His jaw was tight, his brows drawn together in a look of pained confusion. His eyes, those stormy seas, were fixed on her mouth, and she saw a flicker of something raw and hungry in their depths, a desire he was fighting with every ounce of his formidable self-control. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. He released her as if burned, taking a half-step back, the mask of cold indifference slamming back into place. "Watch where you are going, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low growl, but the tremor in it betrayed him. He didn't help her pick up the books. He simply turned and strode away, leaving her trembling in the hallway, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. The brief, intense connection had shattered the carefully constructed boundaries between them. He was no longer just her employer, the grieving recluse. He was a man, a powerful, wounded man whose touch had ignited a fire in her own dormant heart. She knelt on the cold floor, her hands shaking as she gathered the scattered books, but her mind was reeling. She had spent her life avoiding this very feeling, this terrifying, exhilarating loss of control, this sudden, overwhelming awareness of another person's physical presence. She had glimpsed the man behind the wall of grief, and the sight both terrified and captivated her. Their late-night encounters in the library began as a coincidence. Unable to sleep, haunted by the echoing silence of the mansion, Ilara would seek refuge among the towering shelves of leather-bound books, her sketchbook, her only companion. One night she found him there, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the unlit fireplace as if searching for answers in the cold ashes. He acknowledged her presence with a curt nod, and she expected him to leave, to retreat to his private wing. Instead, he remained, a silent sentinel in the opposite corner of the vast room. The silence between them was different now, no longer empty but filled with the unspoken memory of their encounter in the hall. It was a living, breathing thing, stretching and contracting with each quiet breath she took. The second time it happened, he spoke. He saw the charcoal smudges on her fingers and the half-finished drawing of a weeping willow from the garden in her sketchbook. "You have a talent," he said, his voice startlingly soft in the quiet room. It wasn't a compliment so much as a simple statement of fact, devoid of his usual clipped authority. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She explained, her voice barely a whisper, that she had once planned to study art conservation, to spend her life preserving the beauty of the past. As she spoke of cracked glazes and the patient work of restoration, she saw a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. He was listening, truly listening, and for the first time, he was seeing her not as the nanny, but as Ilara. These library meetings became their unspoken ritual. They never planned them, but the gravitational pull of their shared insomnia and loneliness would inevitably draw them to the same room, night after night. They spoke of architecture and art, of the clean, unyielding lines of his buildings, and the fragile, emotional history of her canvases. They were talking about their passions, but what they were truly doing was mapping the contours of each other's souls. He spoke of creating structures that would outlast him, a desperate bid for permanence in a world that had taught him the brutal finality of loss. She spoke of mending what was broken, of finding the beauty in imperfection, a philosophy born from years spent witnessing a slow, inevitable decay. In the soft glow of the library lamps, with the rest of the house shrouded in darkness, the vast social and emotional chasm between them seemed to shrink. Ilara found herself looking forward to these clandestine conversations, to the rare moments when his guard would drop and she would see the brilliant, wounded mind beneath the cold exterior. She started to see his pain not as a fortress to be feared, but as a complex, damaged tapestry she felt an overwhelming urge to understand. She was drawn to his darkness, not with the pity of a caregiver, but with the fascination of an artist seeing a subject of profound, tragic beauty. The desire to soothe him, to reach out and smooth the worry from his brow, became a constant, aching presence in her chest. This growing intimacy was a source of profound internal conflict for Ilara. A lifetime of repressing her own needs, of equating emotional connection with the certainty of pain and loss, had left her utterly unprepared for the intensity of her feelings for Julian. The desire he stirred in her felt like a betrayal of her quiet, dutiful past, of her mother's memory, and of the safe, predictable path she had always believed was her destiny. This man was a storm, and she had spent her entire life seeking shelter. To want him felt reckless, dangerous, a willful step into the very heart of the hurricane. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tangled with a thrilling, terrifying hope she hadn't felt in years. She began to question her own motives with a ruthless honesty. Was this genuine affection, or was it simply her caregiver's instinct, honed to a razor's edge by her mother's illness, latching onto a new and more challenging patient? Julian Croft was the ultimate reclamation project, a man more broken and in need of mending than any fractured canvas. The thought was horrifying, reducing her burgeoning emotions to a mere symptom of her own codependent nature. She felt a wave of shame. She wanted to believe her feelings were pure, that she was drawn to the man himself, the flashes of brilliance, the deep well of hidden sorrow, the unexpected vulnerability. But the doubt lingered, a poisonous whisper that she was simply repeating the only pattern she had ever known. Julian, too, was fighting a losing battle. Ilara could see it in the way he would abruptly end their conversations, his voice turning cold and distant just as they verged on something truly personal. She would see him watching her with Amelia, a look of such profound longing and terror on his face that it made her own heart ache. He was drawn to the light and warmth she had brought into his home, but he was terrified of it. He saw her innocence as a precious, fragile thing, and he believed his own darkness, his unresolved grief, would inevitably tarnish and destroy it. He was a man who had lost everything, and he could not bear the thought of being the cause of someone else's pain, especially not hers. He began to erect new walls, reinforcing the boundaries his own vulnerability had allowed to crumble. He would leave instructions with the housekeeper instead of speaking to her directly. He avoided the library at night, leaving her to sketch in a silence that now felt pointed and empty. His retreat was a palpable rejection, and it hurt more than Ilara could have anticipated. It was a cold, cruel reminder of her place in his world. She was an employee, a temporary fixture, a means to an end. The brief illusion of a deeper connection, of two lonely souls finding solace in one another, was shattered. The distance he created was a chasm of wealth, power, and grief, and she felt foolish for ever believing she could cross it. Yet, the tension between them only intensified with the distance. A chance meeting in a hallway became a moment of unbearable, crackling silence. His gaze would find hers across the vast dining room, and the world would seem to fall away, leaving only the two of them locked in a silent, desperate battle of wills. He was pushing her away to protect her, and she was refusing to be protected. She saw his pain as a challenge, not a deterrent. Her compassion was now mixed with a stubborn, unfamiliar anger. She was angry at him for surrendering to his grief, for choosing to live in a mausoleum when there was still so much life to be lived, for denying the spark of hope she knew she had seen in his eyes. The breaking point was simmering just beneath the surface, a storm gathering on the horizon. Ilara knew she was standing on a precipice. The safe, predictable life of duty and self-denial was behind her. Ahead lay a path fraught with emotional peril, a journey into the heart of a man's darkness with no guarantee of finding a way out. To cede to this overwhelming desire for him would be to risk everything: her emotional stability, her carefully guarded heart, her very sense of self. But to retreat now, to return to her small, quiet life, felt like a different kind of death. It would mean turning her back on the first person who had ever truly seen her, and the first man she had ever, terrifyingly, wanted. One rain-lashed evening, on the anniversary of his wife's death, the fragile truce between them finally shattered. He found her in the kitchen, preparing a warm cup of milk for Amelia. He was disheveled, his tie loosened, the scent of scotch clinging to him like a shroud. His eyes were wild, with a grief so raw and untamed it was terrifying to behold. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, looking at her as if she were the last solid thing in a world that was dissolving around him. And in that moment, Ilara's dilemma ceased to be an intellectual choice. It became a visceral, undeniable imperative. Her fear was eclipsed by a wave of compassion so powerful it felt like a physical force, pulling her toward him, toward the heart of his pain, ready to face whatever secrets lay hidden in the darkness. He took a step toward her, and another, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body and see the fine, shattered lines in the stormy gray of his irises. His control, the one thing that had always defined him, was gone, leaving behind a raw, desperate vulnerability. He didn't reach for her, but his gaze was a physical touch, a silent plea that bypassed all her defenses. "Come with me," he rasped, the words torn from his throat, thick with unshed tears and the burn of scotch. It was not a command, but a confession of need. In that moment, Ilara made a choice that severed her from the dutiful, cautious girl she had always been. She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs, a silent promise to follow him into the heart of his storm, knowing she was breaking the one inviolable rule he had ever set for her. He turned without another word, and she followed, a silent shadow trailing the ghost of a man. They moved through the sleeping mansion, a place of oppressive, sterile silence that now felt charged with a volatile energy. Her soft footsteps were swallowed by the marble floors, but the sound of his was heavy, a leaden march toward a destination he both craved and dreaded. The air grew colder as they approached the West Wing, the forbidden territory he had walled off from the world, from his daughter, from himself. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at Ilara to turn back, to flee to the safety of her room, and the simple, understandable sorrow of her own past. But a stronger, more powerful current pulled her forward, a profound, aching compassion that had become inextricably tangled with a desire she was only just beginning to understand. They stopped before a plain, unassuming door, indistinguishable from any other in the long, dark corridor, but this one was locked. Julian's hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling with a single, ornate silver key. He hesitated, his knuckles white as he gripped it, his gaze fixed on the lock as if it were the gateway to his own damnation. He looked at Ilara then, his eyes asking a question he could not voice. "Are you sure?" She met his gaze without flinching, her own expression a quiet reassurance. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, giving him the permission he seemed to need. The sound of the key turning in the lock was unnervingly loud, a metallic shriek that tore through the silence, echoing with the finality of a seal being broken on a tomb after years of undisturbed rest. The air that rushed out to meet them was not stale or musty, but alive with the ghost of a scent, turpentine, linseed oil, and a faint, lingering trace of lilies. It was an artist's studio, perfectly preserved. Canvases, some vast and covered in bold, abstract strokes of color, others small and intimate, leaned against the walls. Jars filled with brushes stood like bouquets on a paint-splattered table. In the center of the room, an enormous, unfinished painting rested on an easel, a chaotic swirl of blues and grays, a storm captured mid-fury. The space was pristine, cared for, yet frozen in time, a testament to a life violently interrupted. Ilara felt an overwhelming wave of reverence and sorrow. This was not a room. It was a heart, ripped from a chest and put on display, still impossibly, tragically beating with a vibrant, creative energy. She was working on this the day she died. Julian's voice was a fractured whisper, stripped of all its power and authority. He walked to the central canvas, his fingers hovering just above the textured surface, afraid to touch it, afraid to disturb the last thing her hands had touched. The storm, she loved them. She said they were the only time the sky felt as loud as her own mind. He finally broke, a single, choked sob escaping him as he leaned his forehead against the edge of the canvas. The doctors told her to rest. She was fragile, but she wouldn't stop painting. I was in a meeting in Tokyo when I got the call. Aneurysm. Instant. I wasn't here. The confession poured out of him, a torrent of guilt held back for 2 long years, the admission of an absence he could never forgive himself for. Ilara moved toward him, her steps slow and deliberate on the wooden floor. She didn't offer empty words of comfort or touch his shaking shoulders. Instead, her gaze fell upon a smaller, finished painting nearby, a portrait of a young Amelia, her face bright with a joyful, uninhibited smile that Ilara had never seen. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the frame, feeling the love and life captured in the brushstrokes. "She's beautiful," Ilara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What you've done here, preserving her work, her spirit, it's the most profound act of love I've ever seen." She was speaking not as a nanny, but as a conservator, someone who understood the sacred duty of protecting a legacy. She was not seeing a ghost. She was seeing the vibrant, immortal soul of the artist. He turned from the canvas, his face a ruin of grief and astonishment. He had expected pity, perhaps revulsion at the morbidity of his shrine, but not this. Not this profound, artistic understanding. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time in this hallowed space, and the context shifted entirely. She was not an intruder desecrating a sacred memory. She was a living, breathing woman of impossible warmth and empathy, standing in a room dedicated to death, and she was not afraid. The air, once thick with sorrow, began to crackle with a new, terrifying energy. His grief, a cold and solitary thing, was suddenly met with a heat that threatened to melt the very foundations of his self-control. The desire to pull her into his darkness, to feel her life against his, became an unbearable physical ache. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his movements no longer hesitant but driven by a desperate, primal need. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling as they came to rest on her cheek. His touch was not gentle. It was a brand, a searing imprint of a man starved for contact. His thumb stroked the soft line of her jaw, a gesture of such aching tenderness that it sent a tremor through her entire body. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a wild, surging anticipation. This was the precipice she had been walking toward, the moment where duty and desire collided. She could pull away, retreat to the safety of her role, but she knew she wouldn't. She leaned into his touch, a silent, complete surrender, closing her eyes against the beautiful, terrifying ruin of his face. The kiss was not a beginning, it was a collision. It was the desperate, frantic meeting of 2 solitudes, a raw and hungry expression of everything they could not say. His mouth claimed hers with a sorrowful urgency, a kiss that tasted of scotch, salt, and 2 years of unspoken grief. It was clumsy and savage, a frantic search for an anchor in a storm. Ilara met his desperation with her own, her hands coming up to clutch at the front of his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. It was a kiss of transgression, a violation of the memory that filled the room, and yet it was also an act of profound affirmation, a desperate, defiant choice to embrace the living in a sanctuary built for the dead. It was the shattering of a vow and the making of a new one, all in a single, breathless moment. When they finally broke apart, the sound of their ragged breaths was an obscenity in the sacred silence. They stood inches apart, the charged air between them electric with the consequences of their actions. The room had changed. It was no longer just a shrine to his late wife. It was now the scene of their own profound transgression, the place where her ghost now bore witness to their desperate living desire. Julian's eyes were wide with a dawning horror at what he had done, at the line he had not just crossed but obliterated. He looked from Ilara's flushed face and kiss-swollen lips to the unfinished painting on the easel, and a fresh wave of guilt and self-loathing washed over him. He had not only shared his deepest wound with her, he had now implicated her in his betrayal, tainting her innocence with his darkness. The moment was a fragile, crystalline thing, and he shattered it with a single, violent flinch. Julian recoiled from her as if he had touched a live wire, his face a canvas of disbelief and profound self-loathing. The raw need that had driven him to her moments before was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar horror. "Get out!" he rasped, the words gravelly and sharp, a command that sliced through the charged intimacy between them. He wouldn't look at her. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the portrait of his late wife, as if seeking her judgment, or perhaps her forgiveness for this profound act of desecration. He had opened the tomb only to defile it, and the guilt radiating from him was a palpable, suffocating force. He turned his back on Ilara, a rigid wall of shame and regret, leaving her utterly alone in the wreckage of their shared moment. Ilara stood frozen in the center of the studio, her lips still tingling from the brutal, desperate pressure of his kiss. The air, once alive with the scent of creativity and memory, now felt thick with the stench of betrayal. She felt a sickening wave of guilt wash over her, a feeling so potent it made her stomach clench. Had she invited this? Had her compassion been a form of seduction, a naive and arrogant attempt to heal a wound she couldn't possibly comprehend? The vibrant paintings that surrounded her no longer looked like celebrations of life. They felt like silent, accusing eyes. She had trespassed, not just into a forbidden room, but into the sacred, private space of a man's grief, and in doing so had become an accomplice in his self-perceived sin. She backed away slowly, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, and fled the room, the sound of the door clicking softly shut behind her like a final judgment. The following morning, the mansion's silence had transformed. It was no longer the passive, sorrowful quiet of a grieving house. It was an active, weaponized silence, a deliberate and suffocating void where Julian Croft used to be. He was gone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a carefully neutral mask, informed her over breakfast that Mr. Croft had been called away to Singapore on urgent business. The lie was as cold and polished as the marble floors. There was no timeline for his return. The message was brutally clear. What had happened in the studio was not a beginning, but an end. He had run, not just from the mansion, but from her, from the terrifying vulnerability she had briefly made him feel. He was erasing the moment, and by extension, erasing her, reducing their profound connection to a business inconvenience that required a trip halfway around the world. In the days that followed, Ilara moved through her duties in a state of suspended animation. She played with Amelia in the gardens, her laughter sounding hollow and strange in her own ears. She read bedtime stories, the words turning to ash in her mouth. Her mind was a relentless storm, replaying every second of that night in the studio. His confession, the desperation in his eyes, the taste of his kiss, and the chilling finality of his rejection. A deep, gnawing shame settled in her bones. She felt foolish, naive, a small-town girl who had mistaken a moment of a powerful man's weakness for something more. She had offered her heart, a quiet and untested thing, and he had not just refused it. He had treated it like a contagion, something to be quarantined and fled from. The loneliness she felt now was sharper and more profound than any she had ever known. His absence was a presence. He communicated through terse, impersonal emails to his assistant, which were then relayed to the staff. Instructions regarding Amelia's schedule, household accounts, vendor payments, a stream of logistical details that maintained the illusion of control from thousands of miles away. Yet, one afternoon, a package arrived by special courier. It was addressed to her. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a rare leather-bound volume on the restoration of Renaissance frescoes, a book she had once mentioned in passing during one of their late-night library talks. There was no note. The gift was a paradox, an act of both intimacy and immense distance. It was an apology, a confession that he remembered, that he had listened, but it was also a farewell, a final, beautiful object, to signify the closing of a chapter, a severance payment for a broken heart. He returned after 2 weeks, a ghost of the man who had left. He was thinner, his face etched with new lines of exhaustion, his eyes holding the flat, deadened look of a soldier returning from a war he had lost. He summoned her to his office, a space of cold leather, steel, and glass, a room designed for power and intimidation. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his massive desk, a barrier of polished mahogany between them, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked not at her face, but at a point on the wall just over her shoulder, his voice stripped of all emotion, as if he were reading a corporate memo. The man who had kissed her with such desperate, soul-bearing need was gone, and in his place was the cold, untouchable billionaire once more, his armor welded firmly back in place. "Your employment here is terminated, Miss Vance," he stated, the words precise and clinical. "I have concluded that this environment is unsuitable for you. You deserve a life not overshadowed by the complexities of this household." He slid a check across the vast expanse of the desk. The sum was obscene, enough to solve all her father's financial problems and more. It was a blatant attempt to buy her silence, to sanitize their messy emotional collision into a simple business transaction. This should provide you with a comfortable transition. He was not firing a woman with whom he had shared his deepest secrets. He was severing a liability. He was trying to protect her, she knew, but his method was so brutal, so dismissive, that it felt like an act of profound cruelty, a final negation of everything that had passed between them. A year ago, even a month ago, she would have nodded meekly, taken the check with a trembling hand, and whispered a quiet apology for a crime she hadn't committed. But the girl who had entered this house was not the woman who was now being asked to leave it. That kiss, as damaging as it was, had awakened something within her, a core of strength she never knew she possessed. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a powerful tycoon, but a terrified man cowering behind a fortress of his own making. A quiet, steady anger rose within her, not for her own wounded pride, but for his willful surrender to his grief. She pushed the check back across the desk, the soft whisper of the paper a defiant roar in the silent room. "My time with Amelia was never a transaction, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice low but unwavering, holding his gaze until he was forced to meet hers. "And my compassion is not for sale." For a fleeting second she saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of the wounded man she had held in her arms. But it was gone, as quickly as it appeared. There was nothing more to say. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the office, leaving the check on the desk between them, a silent testament to the fact that there were things in the world his money could not fix and could not buy. Her dignity was one of them. The act was terrifying, a leap into an uncertain future, but it was the first decision in her life that felt entirely, unequivocally her own. Driving away from the imposing gates of the mansion, Alara did not cry. She felt a strange and painful hollowness in her chest, the ache of a profound loss. But beneath the grief, there was a new and unfamiliar sensation, a flicker of fierce, exhilarating freedom. She had walked into the heart of a storm and had not been destroyed. She had been dismissed, rejected, and her heart was broken, but she was not broken. She had looked into the abyss of a man's soul and had refused to be cowed by his darkness or his wealth. The world outside the car window seemed sharper, more vibrant. She had lost a job, and she had lost a man she was beginning to love. But in the quiet, dignified act of walking away, Alara Vance felt as though she might have finally, after all these years, found herself. 6 months later, the scent of turpentine and linseed oil was no longer a ghost, but a tangible part of Alara's reality. She had not touched Julian Croft's check. Instead, with her own meager savings and a fierce, newfound determination, she had enrolled in a single intensive art conservation course at the city college. Her days were spent in a dusty, sunlit studio, her hands, once dedicated to measuring medicine, now patiently cleaning centuries-old canvases, her touch gentle and reverent as she brought faded colors back to life. She worked a part-time job at a small, independent gallery to make ends meet, living in a tiny apartment that was entirely her own. The ache of Julian's memory was a quiet undercurrent in her life, a bittersweet reminder of the storm that had awakened her. But for the first time, she was charting her own course, guided not by duty, but by a fragile, burgeoning dream. The invitation arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, a thick, cream-colored cardstock that felt impossibly heavy in her hands. The elegant, embossed script announced the opening of a new exhibition at the prestigious Atherton Gallery, Echoes of a Storm, the unseen works of Liana Croft. Alara's breath caught in her throat, the name a phantom on her lips. He had done it. He had unlocked the door to the West Wing and thrown it open for the entire world to see. He had transformed his private shrine of grief into a public celebration of life and art. The invitation was more than a piece of paper. It was a confession, an apology, and a testament to the profound change she had somehow helped set in motion. It was an unspoken summons, a final, silent question that demanded an answer, and she knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that she had to go. She walked into the gallery feeling like a ghost from another life. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of cultured conversation. Men in tailored suits and women draped in jewels moved through the space, their voices a murmur against the soaring white walls. Ilara, in her simple black dress, the only one she owned, felt a familiar flicker of inadequacy. But as her eyes found the paintings, the feeling vanished, replaced by a profound sense of awe. There they were, the bold, abstract canvases from the studio, the vibrant portraits, and in the center of the main wall, the magnificent, unfinished masterpiece, now titled The Last Storm. He had not hidden his wife's memory away. He had given it light and air and a voice. He had finally let her go by sharing her with the world. And then she saw him. He was standing not in the center of the room but off to the side, near a small, intimate portrait of a smiling woman. He was speaking quietly to the gallery's curator, his face no longer a mask of cold fury or raw grief. The harsh lines had softened, replaced by a quiet, weary resignation that held a trace of peace. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and survived, scarred but whole. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head slowly, and his eyes found hers across the crowded room. The world dissolved. The noise, the people, the clinking glasses, all of it faded into a silent, humming void, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment of profound, shattering recognition. There was no anger, no guilt, only the quiet, undeniable truth of their shared history. He didn't move toward her. His gaze held hers for a long, breathless moment before shifting down to the small hand he held in his own. Standing beside him was Amelia. She was no longer a silent shadow, but a little girl in a velvet dress, her dark hair tied back with a blue ribbon. She was looking up at the portrait of her mother, her expression not one of sorrow, but of quiet curiosity. Then, as if following her father's line of sight, she turned and saw Ilara. A slow, hesitant smile spread across her face, a genuine sunrise after a long night. She lifted her free hand in a small, shy wave, and in a voice that was clear and soft and impossibly real, she spoke the single word that healed every wound Ilara had ever carried. Ilara. Julian's eyes, when they met hers again, were filled with a raw, unguarded gratitude that was more eloquent than any apology. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise of a future that was no longer locked away in a dark room, a new chapter waiting to be written. Ilara felt a smile, true and radiant, bloom on her face, a reflection of the hope she saw in his. The ghosts of the mansion had not been vanquished. They had been invited to dance in the light, transformed from sources of pain into beautiful, enduring memories. The future was an unwritten canvas, vast and open, and full of breathtaking possibility. If this story of healing and second chances touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, and share this journey with others who believe that even after the most violent storm, the sun can find a way to shine again. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below.